How can you tell if you're being distracted? If you're being influenced by distractions that are getting you out of sync, out of focus, out of time with your whole life purpose as a soul? First of all, you need to take a deep breath. And relax. Quiet all of that scattered chatter that fills one's mind. This allows one to slow down that heavy traffic of superficial thoughts that keep one focused on self-related issues. And then there is the opportunity for another focus, a different nature of focus to emerge within one's consciousness. And here is a key to open a new door of thought and reasoning. Simply observe that self is always focused on self at any given point in time. Yes, self is always its own focal point. What self wants to do. How does it affect self? And what does self have to say about all of this? Well, self is saying, pay attention to me and what I want. But remember, self cares about self. Self values self above all else. And that is a nature of energy that fuels a nature of consciousness that limits one's ability to think, reason, or focus on anything beyond self. And that is why we say it is individualistic. It is separated, isolated, disconnected, unable to receive the vibrations and sensations of whole life energy because one automatically feels self-defensive, offended, threatened by the mere thought that there exists something greater than self. Because if it is greater than self, then self must be a lower and lesser state of being. And within that self-focus, one can indeed pay attention, concentrate, and meditate. Yes, one can be determined to hold one's focus on one's goals and objectives within a nature of energy that is limited, restricted, and confined to a self-defined state of mind. So within that isolated dimension of existence, one can be focused or one can be distracted. But that's not really the significant point, the profound point of this communication. What we are saying is that when one remains devoted to a focus on self, as in what I want, when I want it, how I want it, where I want it, what I will and will not do, and what nobody can force me to be or not to be, oh, you know the vibration. One is experiencing distraction. One is being distracted, misdirected into a disconnected, isolated, separated, divisive state of consciousness where self rules, self's territory, self's dominion. The consciousness of self where the focus is so small, so tiny, so individualistic that it cannot receive, perceive, or conceive of the wholeness of soul. Wholeness where all parts are interconnected, where all parts work in harmony and oneness, in sync with each other, where there is a unified focus of thought, reasoning, and action, seen and unseen, where one's consciousness is connected to a greater source and supply of universal consciousness. And you see, self simply cannot focus on that because self is too busy being focused on its individualistic agenda. The problem is that each and every self focuses on his or herself. And as a nature of consciousness, that self-focus is constantly breeding its own nature as the basis of relationships, isolation, disconnection, separation, division, conflict, confusion, chaos, war, as self seeks to assert its will above all things else. Domination, control, conquest. That is the nature of self, and each self is focused within that nature of energy that fuels its existence. Oh, that nature is manifesting at an alarming rate. The whole of existence shrinks to center around self, to revolve around self. Self becomes its own tiny little world, disconnected from the wholeness of life. And so you see individuals disconnected from each other, disconnected from Mother Earth and all living things thereof. And most importantly, self is disconnected from the wholeness of soul, which is the life energy presence that occupies the body. And self sucks, saps, and drains that life energy presence to maintain its lower and lesser existence in one's consciousness. So it is no surprise that there are only a sacred few of the few who can focus on this supreme truth. Life energy has been so depleted at such a massive rate that there only are a few of the few, a sacred few who can attune to the codes and signals of whole life energy. And only those will be able to hear this.
Spiritual war, self versus soul. What is the objective? What is the goal? What is the holistic living truth that must be told about the divine order of soul, and why self would assert its will to go so far as to declare spiritual war against the holistic living essence of soul? The sacred, ancestral, Kemetic priesthood of old has left us truth encoded in hieroglyphs, encoded in the pyramids, encoded in the temples, in the shrines, encoded in the libraries that have been found in the ruins, the artifacts. A sacred order that was told and left very clearly to us about Asar, Seth, Nebuchadnezzar, and their younger son, Seth. Seth expressed a different nature, a nature unwhole.
Seth is noted as being born under unnatural and traumatic circumstances. Quote, "And last there was born Seth, and Seth tore a hole in his mother's side, Seth the violent one." End of quote. It is noted that Seth has been called many names throughout history, and in the following reference he's called Sit Typhon. Quote, "And as to his violent and jealous disposition, it was told how he tore his mother's bowels at birth and made his own way into the world through her side." Page 120, Banu Book 1.
Seth was born as an expression of this order, an expression of a nature that hated all things green and growing. We will quickly come to comprehend that Asar represented the green god of the black land.
While there are many translations of our ancestral tellings, fragments that have survived due to the desecration and destruction upon Kemet inflicted by invading tribes and clans, we here reference the Greek historian Plutarch. Asar taught men and women wisdom, and he taught them all the arts. He it was who first planted the vine. He it was who showed men how and when to sow grain, how to plant and tend the fruit trees. He caused them to rejoice in the flowers also. Asar made laws for men so that they were able to live together in harmony. He gave them knowledge of the gods, and he showed them how the gods might be honored.
He represented holistic living truth. He represented the essence of soul, the wholeness of soul. His keynote was higher peace conscious thought and reasoning in action. Seth took an opposition. He wanted to dominate, control, and rule and take the place to be able to occupy the position of Ausar, creating a vibration of envy, jealousy.
And what did the ancestral Kemetic tellings show us about Seth's nature? We made note in Benu Book 1, quote, yes, Seth was as dry and barren as the desert he ruled. For what he lacked in spiritual strength, he attempted to compensate with the violent force of hostile aggression that focused on a physical crown and throne. Seth's relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, his mate, could only be as dry and barren as the energy he brought for her to nurture. Page 122.
So the objective of a nature like Seth would be to inspire, influence, force, coerce, and otherwise cause feminine to be diametrically opposed to her holistic living essence as a soul. So she would birth a different nature. Obviously, Nebuchadnezzar did not desire that. So she approached the Ausarian kingdom and asked the ancestors most supreme unseen to allow her to join in with what was natural of her nature, and that is to come into a bonding relationship with Ausar and Seth. And so it was, and so it would come to be. The divine social economic family community order of Ausar included not only Seth, but also Nebuchadnezzar. Now when we look at it, what we can say is that Ausar, Seth, and Nebuchadnezzar represented the first genesis of man, he and she, the calling forward of that most supreme seen and unseen essence of who we be, masculine and feminine energy, to come forward upon the earth physically with the embodiment of a new kingdom, of a new order of humanity. And in that holistic living presence of humanity was born Ausar, Seth, and the vibrant expressions of Nebuchadnezzar, who refused to join with this order. Let us be clear that the order then was expressed. The holistic living consumption of the fruits of the tree of life, raw living fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts, herbs, and spice, were the healing elements, the revealing elements of love and honesty and integrity. And that sense of divine humility was expressed through the tree of life culture. The culture of man, he and she, who was then ordained to go forward in the divine union biologically of he and she, to multiply divine order into every offspring and vibration of the generation next. There was a second Genesis. And as we said, there was a second son. A son born out of focus, out of sync, out of time, out of a line with the divine order of earth, wind, rain, and sun. A child who by his nature hated all things green and growing. A child who became the god of storms, chaos, the god of war, a god who in its vibration would become the god of the desert tribes, the god of foreign lands, a god of a second Genesis. We will begin to comprehend the second Genesis that oftentimes is expressed by those who had no comprehension of the Kemetic teaching, had no comprehension of the sacred ancestral culture because they had become so disassociated, so distant. Now I'm going to ask the senior priestess to read the story of one great high priest, Manito, who took the time under the authority of one of the invading tribes and clans that have acknowledged that they learned all that they learned, Plato and others, from the priesthood of ancient Kemet, aka Egypt.
Quote, let us take a few moments to review a 2,300-year-old account of the Hyksos invasion into ancient Kemet by Manetho, noted as priest of Anu, in 3rd century BCE, who wrote in Greek a history of Kemet. Dated from 1674 to 1548 BCE. Quote, Titimius in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily overpowered the rulers of the land. They then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. End of quote. Page 156, Banu Book 1.
Oftentimes, man, he and she, in their conflict, confused, and chaotic state, do not comprehend the tellings expressed by Moses in what is called the Book of Moses, Moses' laws, and etc. We know that Moses was a student of the Kemetic temples. However, when self emerged within our existence, there is a bitter sense of envy and jealousy about soul, because the soul, for essence of who you be, is a very peaceful state, whereas the self is an expression of conflict, confusion, and chaos. It is actually the expression of a jealous God, a God of vengeance, war, greed, and wrath, a jealous God who loved the smell of bloodbath, burnt offerings, and that self then feels the satisfaction of its superiority, the satisfaction of declaring itself as supreme, almighty. And this then transfers into the man, he and she, birthed off of the Sethian nature. Our deepest intent is to make this story as clear as possible. We will begin to comprehend a lot of things that is an absolute necessity for man, he and she, to go forward within this emerging Aquarian age, this emergence of a new Banu cycle. And I'm going to ask the senior priestess to give us a little overstanding.
The name Hyksos is the Kemetic Hykasut, quote, princes of the deserts. Manetho translates the phrase as prince of the shepherds, since the chief occupation of those who lived on the borders of Kemet was the breeding and herding of immense flocks of sheep. These people were whom the connection between Apophis and Seth was made. The foreigners had noticed the similarities between their god Baal and Seth. They thus worshipped Seth in Kemet. The Papyrus Saliar noted, Apophis, the last remaining Hyksos king, took to him Sutek for lord, and served not any god that was in the whole land save only Sutek, aka Seth. Page 155.
So, if that be the case, then we can comprehend when we speak about Seth and the fact that Seth was actually a representation of a lower, lesser god, we can then comprehend that those deities who align with Seth, through those particular individuals that we're identifying within this story as expressed by Manetho, a historical fact, that we will begin to comprehend that what happened with man, he and she, what happened with the divine order of who we be, what happened with the principles of Maat was broken by a lower and lesser deity, and that the lower and lesser deity, which we have identified as the nature of Seth, not as a person, not as a being, but as a state of consciousness, that state of consciousness, that Sethian, that Sethite, that Sutek nature of consciousness is actually an expression that's very present right here, right now, today, as we speak. Let God make it very clear here that when we speak of divine order, we're speaking of those various natures of principles, morals, values, how we behave to each other, how we deal with each other, how we live with each other, will be a reflection of whether we are about the holistic living presence of soul, or whether we live and deal with each other, as was spoken in the beginning of this presentation, as individualistic selves. Therefore, when we look, we can get a better comprehension and understanding of Maat and why that particular element, as a feminine deity, if we look at the sacred ancestral Kemetic expressions, but rather also as a nature of energy that we must adhere to through the mother spirit, through the feminine essence, who give birth to all that we be on the physical scene, that we then must begin to comprehend that we must keep an order that will keep Ma'at present. And therefore, we must then be of Ma'at to keep our soul presence. We must comprehend that the nature of Seth was to dismember the Ausarian temple, the Ausarian body, because our body is the temple from which our soul exists. The objective was so that it would never ever again be remembered. But we're still remembering because the soul exists within us. What was also said is that Seth's objective was to scatter the parts, 14 different pieces all over the world. Out of those 14 different pieces, what we must comprehend is that it did create conflict, confusion, and chaos, because the dismemberment was actually the breaking of divine order.
Plutarch continues his translation, quote, "But one night Seth, as he was hunting gazelles by moonlight, came upon Ausarian and Seth sleeping. Fiercely he fell upon his brother. He tore his body into 14 pieces. Then taking the pieces that were the body of Ausar, he scattered them over the land. Death had come into the land from the time Ausar had been closed in the chest through the cunning of Seth. War was in the land. Men always had arms in their hands. No longer did music sound. No longer did men and women talk sweetly and out of the depths of their feelings. Less and less did grain and fruit trees and the vine flourish. The green places everywhere were giving way to the desert. Seth was triumphant. Jehuti and Nebahet cowered before him, and all the beauty and all the abundance that had come from Ra would be destroyed if the pieces that had been the body of Ausar were not brought together once more. So Aset sought for them, and Nebahet, her sister, helped her in her seeking." End of quote, page 98. It is the soul of femininity that is calling for the Ausarian resurrection.
The wholeness of the Ausarian temple was the expression of divine order. The divine order in the keeping of the principles of Ma'at, the breaking of that Ausarian embodiment into 14 different pieces, was actually a symbolic breaking of divine order, the breaking of the holistic living principles of Ma'at. And in that, the set nature would be able to manifest in its unwhole state. And those 14 different pieces would create different kinds of bent and broken religious states of being. And those religious states of being would carry a piece of the holistic living truth. But that would be surrounded by a nature of conflict, confusion, and chaos, so that the population would never be able to come into holistic living oneness. Then that self-deified nature, that Sethian nature of opposition, will continue to spread like a plague. Self versus soul. And any way it be, we're talking about two different natures of energy that cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Therefore, spiritual war is imminent. And it will be ongoing and continuous until death do its part. Here's the secret. Soul is the essence of life, the holistic living essence of life. Soul carries a nature of energy that is ongoing and continuous. Soul can be entrapped into oblivious nothingness, based on the nature of the energy of one's mental thoughts and reasonings and action, the self. Self is, by its nature, destructive. That self-destructive nature will implode. And that implosion of that self-destructive nature will destroy the fiber of all that it has occupied. So when one surrenders one's sacred being to the occupation of self-destruction is what that being has declared. And that soul will be held in an entrapment of oblivious nothingness. We must comprehend that the body that we merge into is only one part of the living expression. Although that body temple carry all the elements in the essence, earth, wind, rain, sun, and that earth, our body temple, the soil, that wind, our breath, that rain, the heartbeat, the blood flow, and the sun, the energizing vibration of life. If we cannot focus on soul, we are distracted. And if we are distracted from focusing on the wholeness of soul, we become lost and stray in the mind. And we will follow any pathway that comes about. We will jump into any syndrome that satisfies self, asserting its will to become the Almighty, the Omnipotent, the one and only, the glorious presence, the successful one, above all things else. And it does not matter who is sacrificed in the process. So parents actually do human sacrifice with their offspring to get the glory of their self anointed. And if we can comprehend this, we can see very clearly that there are those who do human sacrifice on their own being, because even though they are consuming of a lower and lesser energy, which is a sacrifice of their temple, it does not matter. What the I say very clearly is this: nothing else should matter more than divine socio-economic family community order. First priority, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. Divine socio-economic family community order. We also must comprehend that we do not sacrifice our higher peace conscious nature to satisfy those intruding and invading nature, those individuals who have devoted their life to another nature of energy. We must keep them in a sense of respect so that we can peacefully coexist. But at the same time, we must not at any point in time surrender our soul. And it is not about aligning, assimilating, integrating, and adopting a nature that opposes divine order. And we must be clear on this. So what I am talking about in holistic living reality is that there must be a sacred few who are totally ready, willing, able, and prepared to devote their whole life energy to the resurrection of the divine children of the sun and the sacred garden culture from which we come. We must begin to comprehend that the body is our sacred temple. Those who have been around now, and I know that that is constantly reiterated. The body is our sacred temple. There is no way we can ignore the fact of what has happened historically when the family community order was bent and broken. So it's going to require a lot of work by the masculine and the feminine to come up standard so that we can devote our life energy, our semen, our sperm, those eggs, into housing a mindset and a sacred, healthy body to forward divine socioeconomic family community order. That must be our top priority. And as one listens to the various presentations, please know for a fact that this is the point. And anything out of sync and out of focus with this point is distraction. And distraction and toxic reaction will feed the self-deified nature. And it will implode. But before its implosion, it is a greedy nature. And self will carry you down. We must comprehend it's a lower and lesser energy. Where else would you go? Think about that.